Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Akil Kumarasamy to At Home with Literati this evening in support of Meet Us by the Roaring Sea and in conversation with author Lillian Li. If you're just joining us, just a reminder that the chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase Meet Us by the Roaring Sea from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is accessible to you, and you can access that at any time and submit your questions for Akil. And I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of Akil and Lillian's conversation this evening. And live transcription is available to you on your toolbar as well, should you need it, using the CC icon. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books from Literati in the description directly below me. There's also a little typewriter icon, I think right here, that you can click on and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events and be notified when they hit our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com that have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. Without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our interlocutor. Akil Kumarasamy is the author of the Link story collection Half Gods, which is named the New York Times Editor's Choice, was awarded the Bard Fiction Prize, the Stories Prize Spotlight Award, and was a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for debut short story collection. Her work has appeared in Harper's Magazine, American Short Fiction, Bomb, and other publications. She has received fellowships from the University of East Anglia, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Yaddo, and the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture. She's assistant professor in the Rutgers University Newark MFA program. Joining her in conversation, Lillian Li is the author of the novel Number One Chinese Restaurant, which was an NPR Best Book of 2018 and long-listed for the Women's Prize. Her work has been published in New York Times, Granta, One Story, and Travel and Leisure. Originally from the DC metro area, she lives in Ann Arbor. Please join me in welcoming Akil Kumarasamy and Lillian Li into your living rooms.
I'll be the representative of the audience clapping, Akil. Welcome. Welcome back. I'm so excited to get to talk to you, and especially excited because I can see in the audience a couple of our former improv classmates. For those in the audience who don't know, Akil and I got through the pandemic by taking online improv classes.
Yes.
So we may or may not be breaking out some of those games throughout today's hour. But I just wanted to quickly say that to say that I love your book is not precise enough. I felt warped by your book. I felt distorted by your book. There's a moment in your book where people are protesting digital surveillance, and they put this translucent powder on their face so that the machines can't see them. And after I put down your book, it felt like I was walking around with that powder all over my face. So with that introduction, Akil, would you mind reading a little bit from your novel?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lillian. It's like such a pleasure to be to be in conversation with you, and also just to see you in the Zoom box again, because I miss our improv days, and everyone in our improv group. I miss you all. Yes, I'm just going to read from kind of the middle of the book, just a scene. So basically the main character is an AI coder, and she's just kind of recalling an old job she had when she was in college. At college, she worked at a suicide prevention center. It looked pretty bleak, with linoleum floors and fluorescent light that jaundiced your skin. On your team, there was grumpy, dopey, bashful, sleepy, and happy. The names didn't fit. You were nicknamed Sleepy because you mostly did night shifts and slept in the day. Your face didn't show it, and you sustained yourself with frequent naps during the week. The building was old, from the early 2000s, a labyrinth of cubicles that let everyone squirrel away. The conversations were recorded, and the phones were outdated, so you didn't have the option to video call. Some people would request to see a friendly face before they died. Mostly the callers were lonely. One graduate student hadn't spoken to a single live human for over a month, and she was suspicious that you were an automated robot. Prove you're human, she said, and you recited poetry, told her about your day and coursework. That can all be programmed, she said. Show me that you're really human. It was your first week and you wanted to transfer her to someone else, but you needed this job and didn't want to seem inept. Probably because of your nerves, you just started hiccuping and apologizing. I'm sorry. And when the line went silent, you murmured, please be alive still, dispensing an emotional entreaty which went against protocol. But then from the pits of a whale's belly, she emerged. Thank you. You weren't too sure if all the expulsions and stammering of your body made you any more human. She hung up and you hoped that was not the end for her. There were no follow-ups. Your old coworker, the fifth dwarf, Happy, was fired after working at the center for 2 years. They deactivated his ID and didn't even let him collect his belongings. Everything was shipped to him. In an afternoon conference, the oversight board, which consisted of a woman in her 80s with a hearing aid and a fresh graduate with an eye patch, played the recordings referred to as the love chats. Over the course of a week of mandatory retraining, you listened to the 10-hour conversation between your coworker Happy and the young man caller number 347 he was falling in love with. Caller number 347, or David, said he planned to die that night. He had tidied his things and called his mother, but she didn't respond. So he thought he would call here before he ended it all. His words were careful and slow, like he was standing on the ledge of his voice. Happy stayed calm throughout the first half hour. He asked David about himself and the people in his life. Then, somewhere around the 45-minute marker, there was a shift. David described an incident when he was 8. He had tried to drown himself by sticking his head into a toilet bowl. And in the middle of the story, Happy's voice cracked as he said, "Oh no, you poor thing." And he began laughing. And David said he was supposed to save him and not ridicule him. "Why do you keep thinking you're shit, sweetie?" Happy asked. And David returned the question, "Why do you keep listening to this shit?" Then they kept repeating shit to each other like it was the loveliest word. Happy was known for using endearments that might be deemed overly affectionate. It was his style, but even Happy knew he could stray only so far from protocol. Around 87 minutes in, he snapped out of it, remembered he was in his cubicle and David was teetering over some black hole. "Can I call you tomorrow?" David asked, and Happy said, "Yes, please." That was how it started. He called at the same time and Happy made sure he was at the phone. It went on like that for over a week until the oversight board stepped in. David's number kept coming up in the logbook. A frequent caller was always tagged. The pair of administrators paused the recordings at certain sections to make sure everyone understood the breach in protocol. "Your voice was in my dreams last night. Were you trying to make it shut up? It helped me sleep. I bored you that much. Not the least." Mr. Eyepatch stopped the recording and wrote on the board, "flirting," and then crossed it out. "Think of how many people who weren't helped because of this," he said. "You need to be aware." It was like that for the rest of the retraining. As much as you wanted to block the administrators out, you wondered if they possessed a keener sense beyond hearing or sight that you couldn't access. Even Happy didn't seem to know he was in love when they dismissed him. And it almost felt unethical to dissect feelings that someone didn't realize they possessed. Maybe nothing would have come of those feelings. You always knew the conversations were recorded and no longer belonged to you. And maybe that was true for everything, all your actions, words, purchases. The day after Happy was fired, David called and asked to talk to Happy. When they said Happy no longer worked at the center, David asked for a personal phone number, which they refused to give him. He hung up, never called back. You wonder if, after all this, he felt like dying out of love.
Thank you for reading that passage. It was a roller coaster of like humor and sadness for me. Like see the recording in my face, it's just like my mouth going like up and down, the size of the graph. So Akil, I have like
Yeah.
pages of questions for you, but I think in the spirit of improv, I'm gonna not
Yeah.
throw them out the window.
Throw it out the window.
And maybe just try and like capture the journey of how this book
Uh,
came to be, because it is such a uniquely layered, structured book. It's so non-traditional in the way that it tells a story, in the kind of narrator that you choose, and the story within the story. So I think I would just love to try and reverse engineer
Yeah.
how this came to be. And so I guess my first question is actually just to kind of set the foundation for people who haven't had the fortune of reading it yet. How do you describe this book when you're trying to get people to read it?
Oh yeah, that's a good question, Lillian. As you said, it's kind of like yeah, it's kind of really layered and sort of kind of like this kind of a kind of sort of intricate story. In some ways, I say it's like it's a near futuristic story. It takes place in a kind of a futuristic NYC where kind of AI governs many aspects of life. And it's really deeply about how people care for each other in this digital age. There's this woman who has just recently lost her mother, and she is also an AI coder. And over the course of sort of like her grieving process, she starts translating this old manuscript. And in the process kind of gets entangled with different people. And so in some ways it's like it's that, and at the same time I feel like it's also there's elements of like very much like of like a love story, a ghost story that's kind of like moving backwards in how it deals with memories. But yes, I think it's like a futuristic story about compassion, about how do we care about each other, and how yeah, and thinking about our present world and like in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way of putting it. And you kind of spoke to this when you mentioned that your narrator is translating this older story, which, by the way, older is kind of a funny word because it's from the 90s. Which like could be from where you are in the future in New York, like
Yeah.
50 years ago, 60 years ago. It's not,
Yeah.
it could be older and not just the years that we were born.
This ancient manuscript from the 90s.
But can you also say a little bit about what this manuscript is about and why it captivates your narrator?
Yeah, so this is a manuscript that's written in like it's written in Tamil, and this narrator actually has like she is not Tamil, doesn't necessarily have any sort of like relation to the language per se. It was in some ways just sort of like a random language elective she had to take that related to her AI natural development language course. So this is a manuscript about a group of young women who are studying to become doctors, and they're living at kind of like at the edge of a war and also during a drought. And they're kind of trying to come up with a new way of like kind of surviving and living in this time. And they come up with this idea of radical compassion. And this idea of like radical compassion is something that sort of kind of grabs the narrator as she's trying to kind of like navigating her own grief after her mother's loss. Because I guess that's also a question, like how do you care for others when you're also suffering? So both the characters in this manuscript, like they're living through a drought and they're struggling, but they're also trying to care about the people around them. And this narrator, translator in the future / the present storyline, she is also trying to figure out a way to care for others, even like kind of deeply when she's like deep in her own grief, and trying to navigate those spaces. And also it was kind of interesting for me just to put these spaces that don't seem like they make any sense. Like they don't seem like they're not geographically connected. They're also not like kind of even connected by identity basis. Like how to put these two worlds together in one book too was also kind of interesting for me.
Absolutely. And I think it's also so interesting what you said earlier, where these young medical students are trying to figure out how to live through this really hard time in their lives and how to kind of save themselves. They ultimately choose to be compassionate towards others. So there's this interesting double edge where they kind of try to lose their own suffering by being compassionate towards others, but it's ultimately kind of goes back around to the reason why they're being compassionate in the first place is to kind of save themselves. And
Yeah.
so that, I mean, that's just like kind of par for the course of like what's happening in Akil's book. There's all these amazing philosophical questions that like boomerang back and like slap you in the head. But what I'm really interested in is, you know, you mentioned that these are two things that you wouldn't necessarily think to put together. And so of course my question is like, why did you put them together?
Yeah, you know, it's like I guess how this book started was I started with the inside manuscript, not even realizing it was a manuscript. So just writing into the spaces, I was sort of certain about certain meaning, like I felt some energy in this space. I started the inner manuscript is written in the collective plural, so the first person plural, so it's in the we. So I think I was just like that voice was just really captivating for me. So I was writing into that space. And then also, I think I was just led to different spaces. For example, I was a short-term fellow at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and like looking at different archives. And the book just led me to different spaces. And like this part of the inner manuscript became a manuscript. Like I didn't realize it was a manuscript until I kind of thought of this outside world, kind of interacting with this text. And I was kind of just like, I was becoming more and more interested in how to, like, what is it really like, you know, I fascinated with the idea of translation and how it can feel very intimate. And like you're carrying, you're really kind of, you're really interpreting the words of someone else in a very deep level, a personal level, and also choosing those words. And then there's also this kind of deep act of love in it. And I was wondering how like I could use that act of translation as a way to connect someone to a place that's not even related to them. Like, you know, many people are translating across, translating texts that are not related to the identities, and how would that work from a future context? Also, it's also strange to have this act of translation with AI, because AI is like technology, and like translation doesn't seem like this sort of like especially translation like by hand doesn't seem like a human translation, doesn't seem like this kind of high form of technology. So I was sort of interested in this sort of like these different forms of like technology per se. Yeah.
Definitely. And what you had said earlier about the reason why the narrator takes Tamil in the first place is because it's for her AI programming language requirement. And again, there's like this weird, fun mix of like super high tech and then like a language requirement, which like every freshman has to go through.
You're like, why do I have to take a language?
And another amazing element is that when this narrator is trying to pick which language she like codes like a casino jackpot program in order to kind of like random number generate the choice. I was like, oh, again, just like an amazing additional detail, an additional layer. And it's also really interesting to hear that you didn't know it was a manuscript at first, but then this kind of outside world started to build around it. Was it difficult for you because you got to know that we voice of the medical students first? Was it difficult for you to get as attached to the narrator of who is doing the translating, or did it feel like pretty easy to get to know both sides?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it was pretty easy, and I guess it's interesting because like the inner manuscript is in the collective, you know, it's in the first person plural. So it's like it is the we, which is both like sort of like intimate at the same time distancing. It's like you don't get to really like, it's like they're a collective, so it's not like this so it feels like more like this sort of not a blob is not the right word, but it just feels like this mass that you like. Well, when I got to the outside manuscript, it's written in the second person, but there I felt this more of a sense of the specific the specific entity more so. And I also watched this movie by Agna Varda called The Vagabond. And it's about this woman. She's like kind of trying to reconstruct why this young woman died. The director of the movie is trying to figure out why this young woman died, and like she's kind of recreating scenes and and imagining what would have happened. And I think that relationship between the director and the figure was just really kind of appealing to me. Just how like there's like a deep love. And I think I was in some ways trying to kind of recreate that sort of sentiment of like someone trying to like kind of both like understand this text and to also help herself, but also she's also in some ways trying to like save these girls in some sense through translation. At the same it's translating from Tamil to English, even though translating it into a colonial language that they might not even want to be translated into. So it feels a little bit like a monstrous text, like a text that they wouldn't even want to exist, but she's also giving them a wider audience to live. Yes, I think I was like just kind of fascinated by that sort of relationship. But yeah, I did, but I think both of those perspectives, second person and first person plural, are both like, it's like they're both like kind of you have a quality of like, you know, that intimacy, and at the same time it's sort of distancing. So it was like that liminal space I think I really enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also something about the we that can feel exclusive because you're outside that we. Like they are the group that is kind of like a clique that you're not allowed to sit with, but you can observe from your part of the lunch table.
Yeah, the weave. Everyone wants to be part of a weave, but yeah.
Was there a sense then of, you know, you had this the narrator's attraction to this text, and then you needed to figure out what in the narrator's world was creating this vacuum that she needed to fill with the translation? Was that kind of how you built out the other parts of the futuristic New York world?
Yeah, I guess I think it was trying to figure out like, why, how would this text like affect her life, or how would this text like, you know, because like the main tenet of this text is this idea of radical compassion, and how could like radical compassion really force her to kind of engage with the world around her. So I think that was in the back of my mind, thinking about how these two texts can be entangled with each other more, and specifically through radical compassion, especially when there's so many elements of AI that's kind of governing the world a bit more than our current world. And how can radical compassion be a tool for her in thinking and kind of navigating her current space, especially as she is grieving after her mother's death? Like, how would that look like? So I think since I had the inner manuscript first, I had that. So then I started from working inside out. So the outer manuscript came, like what's happening in the outside the story came later.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's also really interesting to think about how, as she's reading about this idea of radical compassion, that becomes like the lens and the way that she travels through the world. She's kind of, you know, rudderless now that her mother has passed. And it makes a lot of sense that, you know, she can take this text and start to see how it can guide her through the life. And she's also in this kind of detached way where she's almost observing her own life. And it's almost like she's using herself as an experiment for the text. But this idea of radical compassion is also one that was really interesting to me. Was this something that you pieced together through books that you'd read, or was this something that kind of came through knowing the we in this manuscript, like it just kind of came out of the writing?
I think it was like both the we, but also definitely from like reading other texts and kind of just thinking about what it means to care about someone else. There is this. It was always interesting to me about what are the borders of compassion, like what does it mean to become like delirious? For example, like someone jumps on, like someone is on the subway tracks and someone decides to jump on the subway tracks to save that person, and then they end up living. People are like, wow, that person's so compassionate. But if the person ends up dying trying to save someone, they're like delirious, they're crazy. So just like, how do we, so what is that border of like being kind of selfless or trying to see beyond yourself, and where can that become like destructive, or what does that mean to really to become open to other people? And I guess I think those questions became even more like pervasive, or like more on the forefront of my mind like during the pandemic, and just like thinking about like, you know, like what does it mean to care about others? Like, where are these borders between ourselves? And so it started before the pandemic, but then like I think probably morphed a bit even in the pandemic as I was writing it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, you know, once I started seeing radical compassion in your work, I started to, and kind of like your narrator, map it onto other things that I saw in the world. Like when you get in an airplane and they tell you the safety measures, they're like, put your mask on first before you put on anyone else's. I was like, oh, that goes against radical compassion. Or, you know, just thinking about the giving tree, how
yeah.
you can kind of see where that line is, where it goes from being like a really beautiful story to a story where just like this
Yeah.
child is taking everything from this tree. So yeah, it feels like actually a pretty evergreen question, even though that term doesn't come up in our like everyday conversation. But it does seem like something that we're kind of pretty frequently asking ourselves when we engage with anyone who is not ourselves, like how far do we want to push whatever intimacy we have with this person?
Yeah, like what is that line? Yeah, like what is that line? As you said with the airport, like put your mask, put your mask on first before someone else's, or the giving tree. I'm like, wow, I forgot about the giving tree. I'm like, yes, that's you need to use all that tree for it's such a I think that's been a question I think that it's always been sort of interesting for me, just thinking of like what are the borders of like ourselves and other people, and like where and how do we navigate that, or what is what does it really mean to care about somebody, and like how to like what does that really entail, and like and having characters kind of having to push themselves in a kind of more pressure cooker situation, like forcing them to kind of to really answer these questions.
Yeah, and I think that another character that we haven't talked about yet is Sal, who is your narrator's childhood friend who comes and moves back after her parents died tragically. And Sal seems to also be struggling with these questions of empathy and compassion, and also this kind of larger philosophical question, which I'm going to have you explain as well to people, which you call the self-driving trolley problem, I think, in the book. So can you just kind of go through how exactly Sal's parents die?
Yeah. So in this world, there are AI self-driving cars, and then Sal's parents are in an accident, and the cars have this, there's like the cars make a calculation, and Sal's parents are the ones that it's sort of like an inevitable situation, like someone has to die in these calculations, and the cars decide, the Sal's parents are going to die. The algorithm has decided Sal's parents will will die, and they're Pakistani, they're Muslim. So there becomes a question of like how are these cars factoring in data such as like race, class, religion into the kind of into these calculations of like whose life is worth more to save. So she is, and because of this accident, she is an artist, and because of this accident she also becomes like her fame rises because after this accident. So she is also kind of navigating kind of just like even like her own the own value of her art, and also just like what does it mean to become famous after your parents have died from this tragic accident. And she is also trying to create more transparency around AI too. So so they're dealing with these questions.
Definitely. And there's kind of this tension throughout where she wants to meet the woman and toddler who were saved in exchange for her parents' death. This idea of like, well, there was a toddler, so isn't that, in a white toddler, isn't that life more valuable than a Pakistani man who has diabetes in the 50s, so there's like all these, it's like a classic philosophy question, which I remember from the philosophy class I took as a freshman, the trolley problem, where like if you could, the train was like heading towards a group of 5 people, and you could pull a lever and it would switch to a track and only kill 2 people, would you do it?
Thank you for explaining it. I forgot. So so the trolley problem, yes. We did it,
which like haunted me as a freshman.
Because it's the whole utilitarian perspective, like a baby's life, or like a baby's life will be worth more than this 50-year-old man's life, and then like this white baby's life is worth more than this Pakistani 50-year-old man's life with diabetes, or like saving 5 people is better than saving 2 people. All those. It
is just, what's wild to me is like I always just thought about me being the one who has to live with pulling the trigger. Like ultimately it still just becomes like a very selfish examination of like, what am I willing to live with?
The guilt.
And that brings me to mind, like the other side character that was really thrilling for me to read about, which is Rosalind, who's the narrator's younger cousin, who works with this scientist who is kind of like known for being a little bit like a kind of a mad Victor Frankenstein-like guy, and they're working on Alzheimer's research. But in the process, she essentially finds out a way to take somebody's core memories from them and be able to experience it herself. And again, there's like this question that came up for me of like, is that compassionate? Is that empathy? Because it seemed pretty selfish and invasive, but it's in the name of like understanding, you know, a traumatized soldier better. And yeah, I mean, I just would love to hear a little bit more about like how those ideas came to you and what you were trying to explore about empathy from this kind of like memory stealing.
I know it sounds like so awful too. Like, yeah, because like a memory stealing. Yeah, I think memory is a big aspect of the book. The narrator has, she has like her mother has like it's like a kind of an archivist. She has all these kind of objects that she lives with, and they, according to her, they belong to like famous people, but at the same time, she could just be a hoarder. So there's always kind of this kind of physicality of memories that the narrator is kind of working with. And I guess the memory drug kind of just kind of organically came about in just kind of thinking about this idea of the borders between us and someone else. So at the same time, like taking someone's like memory, like if you could have a drug that also allows you to experience someone else's memory, is that, you know, it could be just for like a thrill, like, oh, I could just like, you know, I could experience someone else's pain. At the same time, it could be the sense of kind of allowing you to really understand what someone else went through. So I think I was working on that border throughout, because even in the book, there's also this reality TV show about soldiers. And that's also like, you know, the television itself allows you to experience what like these soldiers are going through, and allows you this kind of window into their lives. At the same time, you're just kind of consuming this violence, and it could feel kind of exploitative, but also just like you're not doing anything about it. So there's sort of this kind of numbness that comes from it. So I think all the television, this memory drug, were just like a different way, kind of different ways to kind of approach this sort of like these borders, and also how we sort of interact with people and the world, and trying to push it to a sort of extreme, like what would it be like to take this drug? And yeah, so I think it was kind of just like trying to think of how to explore compassion through these different lenses, and also like how far can I take this idea of memory. There's this also the character, like the main character is also like, she's really grieving and also struggling. She's trying not to remember too. There's also even like, so have, you know, the memory drug kind of is a way for even the narrator to even try to access some sort of kind of to access her memory. So I think for in some ways I was just looking at these like compassion and memory, and trying to like kind of like find different ways to get at it, and like through each of the characters.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that now I see how clear the line is between watching a soldier's experience on TV, and then kind of like experiencing that soldier's memories, because in both cases you're just like a passive vessel who is just essentially, you're paying witness, but again without the subject's knowledge that you're actually engaging with their emotional experience. It is interesting to think about how maybe in the future reality TV will just be us going through the memories of a Bachelor contestant, and that's how we'll watch reality TV going forward.
It was much more immersive, but like very invasive.
Yeah.
It's like, oh man.
And I also wanted to touch on this aspect of grief that you brought up, where the narrator is very much still going through a grief that was so intense for her that she essentially for 2 weeks completely goes into a fugue state, and what her aunt calls like spacewalking, I believe, which is a great euphemism, very auntie, euphemism to use for having a complete mental break. And it was really interesting to me. So that passage that you read about the Suicide Prevention Center, it's, I think, one of the few moments that we get from this narrator, like pre-grief, before her mother dies. We don't really get much, and it creates this really amazing effect where it's almost like grief is so total that it closes off access to anything before grief could have happened. Like, it so alters the landscape of this person's life, of everyone's life, when it happens. And so I guess I wanted to know a little bit more about how you think about writing about grief, which is often something that is so kind of total and difficult to articulate, and to try and put that down in words.
Yeah, I was trying to think about how yeah, I think you just said it so beautifully, just kind of like how kind of grief kind of cuts us off from the past too, and how it's such an immersive quality. This narrator is not really like, for a lot of the book, she is not remembering like her past memories. Like, we don't really, even when she meets Sal, her childhood friend, there's a lot of things, she's not remembering like so many memories of their time together. It's very, she is sort of really kind of willfully kind of holding memory at a distance. So I think, writing about grief, I think it was also very important for me to also, it's such a strange, and also it's something sort of absurd about it. It's like suddenly reality has sort of kind of like come apart, and everything is sort of looks sort of strange. So I kind of wanted to that book to have that strange, to have that experience of strangeness for the reader, and also like also I think it's sort of funny, like it's a kind of the humor around it. So I think in trying to get that mood or tone, I was also looking at kind of thinking of how grief could kind of brush up against humor, and how to create that kind of tension, because as you said, like space, like, she's like she went into fugue state, and her aunt is like, you're spacewalking, space traveling, it's sort of like, it's like this, we have a strange way of kind of even how we go about talking about death and grief, and it is a very like a strange, like death itself is a very strange quality. Her mom dies in an almost humorous way, just kind of being like starfish on the kitchen floor. So it's just like this really just the kind of strange quality about it. So I was also so I was very intentional in not trying and having the character not really remember, not including like so many childhood memories. And that also was also a structural a structural idea too, because I had so much stuff was happening in the present storyline. I didn't really have space to also, so it was like, it worked on both ways, both like in kind of capturing the grief and allowing me to move structurally in the present storyline, because so much is happening on that line. But yeah, I think also that the format of the book is also in like vignettes. So I think the vignette quality allows the reader to feel more suspended. Yeah. And like also like kind of makes you feel like you're in this kind of liminal space, which like grief sort of feels like. You can't, it's in the second person, you feel kind of disembodied. And it's like the character is trying to find a way to become like back into herself or feel more grounded. So I think both the POV and also just like these vignettes are just like, she's just kind of floating almost.
Absolutely. I mean, that you just like hit the nail on the head of what it feels like to read your book. You feel suspended. You feel like you're in this liminal space. And in part, it's because you don't necessarily have like a traditional plot line. Like, you don't have A happens, then B, which causes C. And you have more of like A happens, and around the same time, B's also happening. And that kind of evokes C, which is kind of related, but then also maybe not so related. It's wonderful because it feels more like a constellation of moments rather than like necessarily like being like kind of like yanked along a plot. And is that a way that you naturally like to write, through kind of vignettes and through a way that's maybe more impressionistic, or is that something that you were trying to experiment with for this novel?
Yeah, I think what I think the structure was informed by like the kind of the themes of the book. And so, yeah, I think I wanted that more kind of impressionistic quality, and like for it to like, I think the first time as like, I remember the first rough draft I was thinking more from like how to move from A to B to C, and like that it was very much more like kind of rounded and a bit more it felt much more weighted, like each movement, that this affects this and that affects that, but it didn't really I felt like it wasn't capturing the mood or the kind of the experience that I wanted. So I think I had to just like kind of like what is happening in the subconscious of like each scene, and what do I want it to that to evoke, and kind of following the kind of emotional through line for that was like how I was like, the emotional through line was how I kind of constructed the structure and the plot. And I think what you said was perfect, which is like things are just like orbiting each other, like this person, like this is happening, and then like this is happening, and then like, but like no, they're orbiting each other, and then sometimes they collide, and then that creates some sort of like bigger mass, and that is like turning. But it's all kind of like, I think that there was this quality of like kind of entanglement in the story. Like I think even thinking about like, I talk about the quantum physics a little bit about entanglement, but I think there's just this quality of just things are just sort of like are pulling and attracting each other in like kind of unusual ways that are not clear until like later, perhaps.
Yeah, and then can you actually go through the quantum physics that you bring up in the book?
Oh yeah, so yeah, I'm trying to like, yes. What did I remember? What did I write? No, just there's so one of the characters, so this whole idea of kind of entanglement, quantum entanglement, and how a particle could be affected by something that's from like a kind of like a long distance away. I think like Einstein called it like a spooky distance. So two particles that are from like that are very far away could actually be affecting each other. So that is a quality of the book itself, because we have this manuscript that is from the 90s, from the distant past, and this woman in the future, and they're becoming in ways that seem like unusual. It doesn't seem logical that they would be affected. They're affecting each other, but they are in ways. And also the characters in the book also are like they find themselves in a kind of unusual, they're kind of like they're back in each other's orbit, and they're affecting each other in ways they are not even fully aware of. So it's like a lot of people and characters circling each other. So both like in the structure of the book, the characters themselves, and they're affecting each other in ways they can't even conceive. So yeah.
That's amazing. And I mean, I love that theory because it's so much more interesting than the butterfly effect, which is that kind of like a butterfly flaps its wing, and then A, then B, then C, and then there's a tsunami. And it's more just like a butterfly flaps its wings, and like it doesn't really affect anything around it. But then like on the other side of the world, somebody drops their popsicle. Like that's like the true randomness of it. But then it's like so fun to try and like kind of write a narrative onto how those two things could possibly be connected. And so it's so interesting to hear that in some ways having this manuscript from the 90s, the distant past, and the manuscript from like the nearer future, talking to each other, we almost want to put a narrative over it. Like we end up doing some of that work because we want to fill the vacuum of like, why are those two things related? And the narrator herself is doing that work too. She's like, I was in this period of my time, and that must be why the manuscript found me. Like it all kind of fits together in her mind, even though in many ways it's just total random change.
Random. You want to make meaning, so it's it's.
So I just caught the time. It has really flown by, and I want to make sure that if there are questions in the audience that we get to them. Otherwise, I have many more to go through.
We do not have questions just yet, but I'll remind folks that if they have questions for Akil, they can submit them in the Q&A. But Lillian, I'm happy to turn it back over to you for your additional questions.
We'll also take suggestions of a place that could fit on a stage.
Costco.
It's always Costco. It's like the most popular improv suggestion.
I know, it's Costco or like Taco Bell or something.
So we've talked a lot about how this book came to be, and then also the kind of all the amazing philosophical questions and themes and stories that are happening within it. And so I'm also really interested in figuring out what happened once, like how this book continued into becoming like a what is in my hands today. And so, can you tell me a little bit about how many years it took to go from like idea to today, and what that journey was like?
Yeah, I guess this was like, I feel like I probably will not have created a book like this. This was a very strange process because I sold a book with my short story collection, and I didn't even have a book at the time, the novel at the time. So when I gave the first draft to my editor in 2019, I think, before the pandemic, and it was this book, but it wasn't this book. It had both of the storylines trying to interact. So I think it was also unusual because it was like my editor had no idea what I was going to hand him. So it was just like total surprise. Like everything about the book was like a total surprise. So it was great that he also was really excited about the book, and it was, I think for me, it was like also the strange process of just like a drastic revision. I was constantly just like doing crazy revisions to the book, and kind of a bit more like imaginatively crazy and like fearless about just like I'm like, I'll just change the whole book this way, and just making big turns. And also during the pandemic, I got the job at Rutgers, and I moved back to Jersey, and I was living at home with my mom for some time, and she randomly read the book and started giving me some feedback, which was really good. So in some ways, she also became part of the book. So there's a lot of just conversations, and also just seeing how much I could push things in the book, and just thinking about not being afraid of going to a kind of wild, strange places, with the memory drug. And also pulling stuff from my own background. I used to also program in the past, and so just like pulling out from like random things in the past. And strangely, the book is really very much about languages, and during the pandemic, I also started studying some languages too, and I for example, German. And in the summer, I did this 7-week German immersion program, which was really strange. We had to speak German for 7 weeks. It was very strange. But yeah, I think this book it led me to strange, unusual places, and I kind of followed it sort of intuitively, and it was a very enjoyable process. Yeah.
And the book followed you too. I mean, I just think about all the random happenstance of, having gotten the job at Rutgers, moving back home, talking to your mom about that. If none of those things had happened, what would this book look like? Verses of like the
verses.
Yeah. And I realize we have 2 questions that have come in, so I'll go and ask the first one from Merrick.
Hi, Merrick.
Can you name some places that influenced you when world building the futuristic New York City setting? Why did they appeal to you?
Some places. That's a good question. Yeah, I think I was kind of some of the story takes place in Queens. It was strange because I was both trying to, you're thinking of New York now and trying to think about it, like what it would be like in the future. So I was both trying to not just think about it like how I would linearly think about it. Like, okay, this will just be the same but larger. So I was trying to think a little bit like how to sort of how to imagine things in a more unusual way, but also I didn't want to just like create things with different names, this is like the new iPhone, it's iPhone 10, like this, it's called something else. So I think that was a question of how to world build at the same time. I didn't have to imagine everything, like every aspect of the life in the future. I just had to kind of really zone into a few things and places, and really make those things feel alive. So I think when I thought about world building everything, that felt a bit like overwhelming, and I don't think I was as interested in thinking about all the new objects per se. So just like, how do you just like figure out like what is important in this world, and just kind of focus in on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I've heard that with on the flip side with historical fiction, don't name every thing that is happening in history. Like, don't say it's like a Bakelite doorknob, because the
Yeah,
person
yeah.
there would never be thinking like, this is what this doorknob is made out
Yeah,
of. It's just a doorknob.
exactly. Just a doorknob, which is also just like a relief. You could just say doorknob, like you don't have to be like.
But now I wish you did have like come up with like a futuristic iPhone, because now I'm just thinking of all the possibilities, like a cyborg alien phone, S
Cyborg,
phone.
I missed out. Next time.
I think that links actually pretty well with what
Yeah.
Josh McDaniel asked, which is, will this book spawn a shared universe for future novels?
Who knows? Who knows how this book will be entangled with future books? But possibly it does. Yeah, possibly it could be. I'm not aware of anything at the moment, but who knows?
Yeah, but you weren't aware of a lot of things when you were writing this book.
Yeah,
either.
I was not aware of most things while I was writing this book. So a lot of uncertainty. That's like, I think that's also like a theme in the book, uncertainty. Like there's like the power of uncertainty and the unknown. Yeah, superposition.
You're just like, it's good to deal with uncertainty as you're like uncertainly writing this book.
This is how you write a book, just complete uncertainty the whole way through.
This is what it means to be alive and human.
Human, exactly. You just have no idea. It's like, you're in pitch darkness all the time. But
and then you ask your mom for some advice, and it's
right. She tells you, and you're like, that makes complete sense. Why didn't I come earlier to you?
Do you remember any of the things that your mom told you that you were like, oh, that actually really helps with my book now?
Yeah, I think she is the one who sort of like I think for like the for the self-driving car accident, she sort of like maybe sort of implanted it into my mind a bit. Yeah. Like she also just went to my mom is a programmer, not related to AI at all. But like they sent her to some AI conference, and she just like I think she had like some paperwork about things, and she was just and she started like talking to me about different things. But yeah, she sort of like even some like really crucial things in the book for my mom.
I also really like just the almost hermit crab way that I think when we're like honestly thinking about how, at least like I write novels, it is sort of just like I'm just like pulling everything that I have in my pockets out, and I'm just like, one time I went to Benihana, I'm gonna put that into the novel.
every experience, every like, random thing that has happened, we detail, trying to remember everything. I love that image of like, everything in my pockets. like some old gum, use it. Yeah.
And I know that we're coming down on time, so I just have a couple of final questions, just like my own curiosities. But can you tell me a little bit about how you came to this title, and then maybe also how you came to this beautiful book art that you have?
Yeah, the title was actually a very long journey. Like I really came up with it on the last possible day. It was like we couldn't, like I had to come up with a title at that point. I was actually actively thinking of a title for a really long time, which is strange because for the first book, Half Gods, my first book, Half Gods, it just came so easily. It was just like I had the title already. For this, it was a long time. I was actually with some friends in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and we actually took a paper out, and we were actually trying to like write down all the themes and trying to make some sort of map. But also, I guess randomly, my mom gave me the word roaring. Roaring is like a really it is like a word used a lot in the kind of old Tamil texts. And I was sort of thinking about how can I have this title interact with both the present storyline, the present future storyline, and also the manuscript. So I feel like this is like a title that makes sense when you reach the end of the book. It's like it's a title that kind of emerges at the end of the novel that kind of like I think comes together. So yeah, I was thinking of how to make this title kind of really speak to both places, and also it's sort of like this idea of entanglement, like sort of like a meeting of these two spaces that don't really seem like to go together again. And the cover actually was very easy because the designer he really loved the book, and this was his first design, and everyone was like, "This is perfect. This is amazing." And yeah, I think I couldn't have even really imagined the cover, and like I feel like he got the kind of the essence of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like all the ways the squares are kind of floating in space.
Space.
Near enough to each other that you're like, oh wait, what picture is it forming? But it could just be completely random images.
It could be really random images. It could be forming some bigger picture, or it could be random images. And then like the boxes could be televisions. There's just like a lot of, you could really read into this cover.
I also really love what you're saying about how in some ways it's like the roaring sea is this distance between two completely totally disparate and entities that may never be able to reach across each other. And it feels very evocative too with the fact that we're having this conversation over Zoom. You're in New Jersey, I'm in Michigan.
And we're in boxes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so true.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Akil. And I'll just throw it back to John to close us out.
Thank you so much, Lillian. It was always so lovely to chat with you.
Thank you, Akil. Thank you, Lillian. We're so happy to celebrate Meet Us by the Roaring Sea here at home with Literati. Hopefully, both of you can reunite soon in person and perform on stage. For my college years, I remember the 2-person improv shows were always pretty incredible, and I feel like that could. There's something brilliant here. So, but once again, please buy a book from us. There's a link in the chat. There's links in the description below. Akil, Lillian, thank you so much for your time, and to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you at the next event. Have a great evening, all. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.